So I'm going to take care of giving him his permissions, spotlight his video, and take it away, Dave.
All right, well, thank you, and welcome everybody. Hope you're having a good afternoon. My name is Dave Husman. I live in Omaha, Nebraska, and while I model 1903 era in Pennsylvania, I worked for a Class 1 railroad for 37 years. And during that period, I had a lot of opportunities to deal with trackage rights, both as from the standpoint of a host railroad and as a tenant railroad on other railroads. So I thought I would give a little talk on how trackage rights works in that. Let me see if I can get my screen shared here. And there we go.
And just a reminder to all the participants, make sure you bring up your chat window. If you have questions for Dave as you go, just type them in there and Dave will probably leave 10 minutes at the end for questions or so.
That'll be good.
And,
hopefully everybody can see the sign that says trackage rights.
Yep, it looks good, Dave.
Okay. What we're going to talk about is what trackage rights are, how they're established, how do they work. Then we're going to talk about what's not trackage rights, and I'm going to give you some examples of that can be used for modeling. So, well, first off, what are trackage rights? Well, there's a different range of options for operating on a railroad, a prototype railroad. There's full ownership, where one railroad has a sole ownership and operation of the railroad. That's the vast majority of railroads in the United States. There's what's called a joint facility. Joint facility is where multiple railroads own the track and they jointly operate on it. They can own a short line railroad. For example, the Galveston, Houston, and Henderson Railroad between Galveston, Texas, and Houston was jointly owned by the Katy and the Missouri Pacific. They can be a third-party terminal. For example, the Houston Belt and Terminal Railroad in Houston, Texas, was owned by the Missouri Pacific and the Santa Fe. It can be a union station, or it can be any other facility that the railroads multiple railroads own. Trackage rights, which is what we're going to be talking about, is where there's a host railroad, and I'll use the terms host railroad and tenant railroad. The host railroad owns the track, and the tenant railroad has rights to operate on it. There's also two other things which are similar. There's haulage rights. That's where a host railroad owns the track, and a tenant railroad has the right to interchange trains to the host, and the host operates them as an agent for the tenant railroad. And then there's a reciprocal switch. That's where the host railroad owns the track, and the tenant railroad has the right to interchange cars to the host. The host switches them and spots them and handles them for the tenant railroad as an agent for the tenant. And we'll get into a little bit more of those later. So there's a variety of different ways that the railroads can interact between themselves. The trackage rights, the host railroad owns the track, and it allows another tenant railroad to operate over its track. It has the track, it provides the dispatching, it maintains the track. The tenant railroad doesn't own the track, but it provides the power, the crew, and the cars, in other words, the train. And it operates over the host railroad as if it was its own track. So it's not an interchange. The tenant railroad has cars and their engines and their crew all remain in the tenant railroad's account. The tenant railroad is responsible for liability on all the commodities. The host railroad is not in the route. It's not an originating carrier. It's not a terminating carrier. It never appears on a waybill of any of the cars operating in the trackage rights train. And the host railroad does not participate in the division of revenue. If there's a BNSF train that is operating over the Union Pacific on trackage rights, the Union Pacific will not show in a waybill. It won't show in any of the documents if you look at that car. As far as the shipment of that particular, any car on that BNSF train operating on trackage rights, the Union Pacific doesn't exist in there. It's entirely as if it's the BNSF. So how do we get trackage rights? One railroad just can't operate over another railroad. The railroads are all privately owned. They're privately owned companies, corporations. So they have to have some sort of a contract between themselves. The modern term for that is an interline service agreement. And it's a contract, a legal contract between the railroads, and it specifies all the conditions of the trackage rights. Now, just to set what we're talking about, when you think about trackage rights, if you think about it this way, Walmart builds a big brand new store in a town, and Target comes in and says, hey, I'd like to use 1/4 of your store to set up my own store inside of your building. So that's the conversation that sets up trackage rights. So we have to talk about why in the world would Walmart agree to let Target do that. So there are many reasons why they would actually do that. There's swaps, operational benefits, swaps for different things, access for access. So I'm going to give you trackage rights from A to B, and in return, you're going to give me access from D to F. There's access for other benefits. I'm going to give you trackage rights, and then you're going to allow me to dispatch a interlocking. You're going to give me access to a different facility. There's, that type of thing. There's improvements that might happen to the track. For example, if I'm going to operate on your railroad, I will help pay half for CTC. I will help pay half to extend sidings, to add sidings, to install multiple main track. There are lots of different things that the two railroads, if you let me operate on you, I will help improve this portion. There's also bridges, facilities. Okay, we need a new bridge. If you give me trackage rights over your bridge, I will help pay half the cost of the bridge. If you put in a new mainline fueling facility and let me use it, I will pay half the cost of the mainline fueling facility. Then there's also facility retirements. So if you let me have trackage rights here and I let you have trackage rights there, you might be able to retire something that's a very costly facility. So it might have you some sort of benefit there. There's an economic benefit, which is normally not a big deal. Trackage rights, the way that the railroads don't share in the revenue. So the way that the host railroad gets paid is by some sort of a direct payment. So if you've got some sort of an old branch line that only has 1 or 2 trains a day, and I want to operate my trains over your branch line and upgrade it to mainline status and pay you to operate over your branch line, it might be an economic benefit to allow you to do that. And finally is kind of the, especially for modern modelers, the big one, the legal and government conditions. Local governments, that's states or cities, can form a partnership with the railroads to use trackage rights to reduce congestion in cities, or to make public improvements. A lot of that is things like if they have a highway expansion, an urban renewal, if they have sometimes things like forming a lake or a dam or some sort of a drainage or navigational improvement, they will have, the government will negotiate trackage rights between different railroads. And finally, the big one is that if you have an area where you're going to have a merger and you're going to go from where there were 2 or more railroads and you're going to go down to 1 railroad because of the merger, the government, in order to consent to allow the merger, may require the railroad to give trackage rights to another railroad in order to preserve competition. And that probably accounts for, I'd say, probably 1/4 to 2/3 of all the trackage rights that are out there today. On the Union Pacific, there was about 25% of the mileage of the Union Pacific system had trackage rights on it, and the majority of that was due to merger conditions, where we granted other railroads the ability to operate in order to satisfy either the ICC or the Surface Transportation Board. Since we're talking about mergers and that brings up kind of a question about eras. And there's a couple different ways that goes. Prior to the mega mergers, the 1980s, 1990s, most of the trackage rights were actually for operational benefits, or they were for operational improvements, economic benefit, and most of the trackage rights were fairly short. There are also some of the really older trackage rights may be driven by the financial entanglements of the railroads and the financiers. If you're Jay Gould and you own the Katy, the Missouri Pacific, the Rock Island, and the Wabash, and you decide it would be really cool if the Missouri Pacific had the ability to get over a piece of the Rock Island, since you own all of the railroads, you can pretty much convince them that they need to grant trackage rights. Nowadays, those relationships don't exist, other than the fact that all the railroads that were separate railroads are now merged in one big one. After the mega mergers, the trackage rights were for satisfy the legal conditions of the mergers, preserve competition at 2-to-1 locations where you had 2 railroads, they merged, and now you only have 1 railroad. Probably one of the worst case scenarios of that is the state of Utah. State of Utah had 4 major railroads in it, the WP, the UP, the SP, and the DNRGW. And then the WP and the UP merged together, and the DNRGW and the SP merged together. So now you're down to 2 railroads. And then the UP and the SP merged together, so now you're down to 1 railroad. So the state of Utah, there's a lot of trackage rights there, because they basically eliminated it down to 1 railroad serving pretty much the entire state. I realize the Utah Railroad is there also, but it's a regional and really doesn't connect to too much outside the state. The other thing is that trackage rights continue after the mergers. They're inherited. So if in 1895, if I'm granted trackage rights, 6 mergers later, the railroad that ends up with my 1895 railroad still has the trackage rights that they had that were granted in 1895. So that's can be handy. Let's talk a little bit about how trackage rights work. The key thing is this contract, the interline service agreement. It specifies in great deal a whole bunch of different things. It specifies the on and off junctions where the trackage rights is granted to and from. That can be stations. It can actually be individual switches that the tenant train must get on the host at this switch and go to that switch. It may specify the route. There have been cases where a railroad was granted trackage rights from A to M and then from G to Z, and they tried to run a train from A to Z and were told no, they couldn't do that because their trackage rights specifically said you have trackage rights to come on at A and exit at M, and the trackage rights doesn't give you permission to go all the way to Z from A. So they can be very specific on the route and where they can get on and off. A big one, especially for modeling, is service level. Trackage rights can specify just overhead. In other words, you can't serve industries, you're just running from A to B. It can also allow local access. So in other words, I can now serve industries along the trackage rights route. Overhead is much more common than local access. The trackage rights can specify the number of trains you're going to operate a day. That can be unlimited number. It can be only several trains a day. It can specify spacing a train every 6 hours or something like that. The majority of the ones I'm familiar with are unlimited. It can specify the types of trains. You can run anything you want. You can run premium trains. That's autos and intermodal product. For example, the SP had trackage rights from Chicago to Kansas City on the BNSF through Fort Madison, and that was just premium product. They couldn't run coal trains on that route. It may specify that you can only run a local train. You might be able to run bulk trains. Bulk trains might be prohibited, no coal trains. The makeup of the trains is specified. That's how long they can be, how much horsepower they have to have, what the minimum speed of the train is. Rail cars have a speed restriction on them, so you have to have trains, cars. You can't put a 35-mile-an-hour scale test car on the Santa Fe Transcon. They'll get upset with that. There may be restrictions on hazardous material or other restricted loads, wide loads, heavy loads, et cetera, et cetera. The tenant railroad provides the power and crew, and the cars remain in the tenant's account. So the interchange railroad, there's no interchange. The host railroad doesn't know whether the cars in the train are loaded or empty, doesn't know the commodities, doesn't know the customers of any of the cars on the train. And actually, until AEI became automatic equipment identification became common, the host railroad didn't even know what cars were on the tenant train. So that actually created a problem later on that we'll discuss. And I think they probably have it fixed, but they were working on it when I retired. Operations. The host railroad's timetable and operating rules are what the tenant trains use. So if I'm a Reading Railroad operating on the Western Maryland, I would use the Western Maryland rules because I'm operating on the Western Maryland. However, the tenants, any kind of special instructions to the trains as far as train makeup, how they place cars, how they handle air brakes, et cetera, that are in the tenants rule book, those would still apply to the operation of the train. And of course, there is no free lunch, so there is a payment. And so the tenant railroad would pay the host railroad by some type of arrangement, and that would be car mile, ton mile, loaded car mile. There might be a flat per train fee. It might be splitting the maintenance costs on some sort of formula, something like that. And as things normally do, things can go wrong. And so generally the tenant railroad assumes all liability for any kind of disaster that it is involved in. If the BNSF is detouring on the KCS and the BNSF train, or not detouring, excuse me, the BNSF has trackage rights over the KCS and derails the train, the BNSF is responsible for picking it up. Now that can be modified in the agreement, but in most cases, the tenant is the one that assumes liability. Dispatching. The host railroad provides the dispatching services. And the key fundamental thing that the way this is supposed to work is that the host railroad is supposed to handle the trains equitably, and as if it was the same class of priority as a host railroad train. So if I'm a UPS train, a UPS train on the BNSF is supposed to handle my train exactly the same as it would handle one of their UPS trains. If I'm an empty grain train operating on the CSX is supposed to handle me just like they would handle one of their own empty grain trains. So it's just supposed to be equitable. Same thing. Most of the dispatchers that I know want to get a trackage rights train off their railroad as soon as possible, and so they're going to handle it just like they would any other train, just to get it off the railroad. It's just another train to them. Now, on how does a train actually get onto trackage rights? There's two different ways we'll talk about. One is the old being pre-computers, let's just put it that way, pre-computer. The tenant railroad would notify the host railroad that they're going to be operating a train. They'd give them some sort of lineup, and that would be somewhere in the 12 to 24 hours in advance. If they had scheduled trains operating on the trackage rights, of course, the schedules would be out there, and the host railroad would know that the scheduled trains are going to be there. When the crew that is going to operate the tenant train over the trackage rights is called, the tenant railroad provides train sheet information. That's the federally required information that the dispatcher needs. That's the train name or symbol, the engine numbers, the on-duty time of the crew names, loads, empties, tons, feet, and we'll also give them an ETA, when it's going to be at the junction. As soon as the host railroad gets all of that train sheet information, they can then provide train orders to the tenant railroad or the tenant train. Now they can do that in a couple different ways. They can copy their orders to an operator on the tenant railroad at the crew's origin. They can operate it to, so in other words, if I'm a train operating from Houston to Fort Worth, and I'm going to operate over the Katy Railroad, the Katy could give the Missouri Pacific operator at Houston the train orders that it has, and they could copy those train orders and give them to the crew right out of origin. Or the host could give the orders to a tenant operator online. So let's say I have a train order office I'm on the Missouri Pacific. I'm going to be operating on trackage rights over the Katy. Let's say the Missouri Pacific has a train order office at Valley Junction, which is just short of the Katy. So he's going to give the Katy orders to the Missouri Pacific operator at Valley Junction, who will hand them up to the train as it goes by. Or there might be an operator at the junction and he just waits till the train gets there and gives it to him. The dispatchers continue to update the ETA by either lineup or phone message or something. I know this comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but the dispatchers do talk to each other. Even they talk to each other adjoining territories and to the dispatchers on other railroads. And finally, when the crew gets to the junction to get on, they announce themselves, or they talk to the operator, and the operator talks to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher brings them on. Now, on the flip side of that is that the host dispatcher, as the tenant train moves across the railroad, depending on how long it's going to take to move, the host dispatcher will then tell the tenant dispatcher when he's going to get his train back. So then that communication kind of flips and it goes the other way from the host to the tenant. In the new and improved post-computer world, there's a AAR messaging system, EDI 161, that 48 hours before the train is going to get to the host railroad, the host railroad gets an electronic message that says, hey, here's a train from this other railroad. They're intending to operate it over your railroad. Then as the train, that arrival time at that ETA gets updated, the systems automatically update the ETAs. Finally, when the crew that's going to operate over trackage rights is called, as they're put on duty, there's either a message faxed by the dispatch office or an electronic message sent to the host railroad, and then the host railroad dispatcher can then issue warrants and bulletins or train orders, whatever the authority method is. And in the modern world, they're typically sent to the crew on duty location. Once again, dispatchers update the ETA by message or phone. And then when the crew gets to the junction, either the crew announces or the operator there tells them that the train is ready to come on, or in the new and improved modern world, the dispatchers have track displays of the other railroad in their dispatching office. So if the BNSF is the host and there's a UP train that's going to come onto the BNSF, the UP dispatcher will have a BNSF dispatcher panel display of the trackage rights area, and the BNSF dispatcher will have a UP dispatcher panel that shows the trains approaching the trackage rights, so that everybody can actually automatically see, just like their part of their railroad can see the approaching trains and will know, so they can plan their operation better. There's also a couple considerations that are new and improved wrinkles. Some of them, your tax dollars at work. Positive train control added a new thing, because positive train control is a safety system overlay over the signal system that enforces a train staying on its route and not exceeding its authority. Well, in order to know whether or not a train is exceeding its authority or going off route, it has to know the route. So there was a whole bunch of work that had to be done in advance of PTC to make sure that the schedules of the trains and the routes of the trains with all this messaging were correct, so that the different railroad systems would know where the train was supposed to go. And that's harder than you think because the different train names that they might have. And then there's hazardous material implications. If you'll remember earlier, I said that the host railroad does not know, actually until AEI didn't know what cars were on the train, and then doesn't know whether they're loaded or empty, doesn't know what commodities that are in them, and doesn't know who the shippers are of any of the loads. So the railroads suddenly realized, well, hey, with all the methyl ethyl nasty that we're handling, especially toxic inhalation hazard and poison inhalation hazards, chlorine, poison gas, all that other good stuff. If we have a derailment and something gets loose, we won't know what's in the cars, and we can't tell any of the first responders what's leaking, what just blew up the city, because we don't have any of that documentation. So when I retired in 2017, they were working on resolving that and figuring out some way to share hazardous material without giving each other proprietary information. The other thing that is post 9/11 world is that there's a federal requirement from the Department of Homeland Security that if the threat level, security threat level reaches a certain level, the Department of Homeland Security will ask the railroad where all their toxic inhalation hazard cars are. And within 30 minutes, the railroads have to provide the location of every single loaded toxic inhalation hazard car on the railroad. Now, that's actually not a big deal. The railroads can do that. It's real easy for them to figure that out. Except that if you have a trackage rights train and you don't know what's on the train, you don't know where those TIH, PIH cars, if they're on your railroad or where they are. So that was another new wrinkle that had to come into effect. That really doesn't have that much to do with modeling, but it's kind of an interesting wrinkle. We talked a little bit about what's in trackage rights. Let's talk about what's not trackage rights. The excuse me. One thing that is not trackage rights but looks like trackage rights is detours due to derailments and other incidents. So the Southern Pacific parallels the Missouri Pacific between New Orleans and Beaumont, Texas. And the Southern Pacific is right along the coast. And so every time there's more than a couple inches of rain in South Texas and Louisiana, and there's flooding, a barge gets loose and attacks one of the lift bridges on the SP on their route. So the SP wants to detour over the Missouri Pacific because a barge is eating their bridge. The way they do that is through a superintendent's agreement. All the railroads agree to the detour rate, a standard fee for detours, and to a procedure for allowing a train to operate. Because of that, the duration and the route that the detoured trains take is ad hoc. It's made up on the fly, depending on where the event is. The limits and what type of train makeup and how many trains and all that other stuff is all made up on the fly, generally between the chief dispatcher's office and the superintendent or general superintendent's office. The rights are not permanent. They may be granted, modified, or revoked at any time. And the host railroad, because this is an area where the tenant railroad typically does not operate, the host railroad has to provide what's called a pilot. That's an employee that rides with the tenant crew and helps guide them across the railroad. You know how when we talk about an operating session, you want to always, you've got a newbie that's never been across the railroad, so you put an experienced guy with him. The experienced guy on a real railroad would be called a pilot. Now, if it's a really long detour, so let's say the Santa Fe piles up a bunch of cars on the Transcon and they want to operate on the over the SP from Kansas City to Yuma or something like that, then of course they can't, Santa Fe can't use their crews, it's too far. So then the SP, if they agreed to the detour, they would have to provide their crews. And that's usually the sticking point of trackage rights, or excuse me, of the detour. On trackage rights, the tenant railroad provides its own crews, so that's not a big deal. On detour agreements, the host railroad has to provide some of the people to run the trains. And so if they don't have enough people, that limits how many trains they can allow to operate around the derailment. And then the other thing that looks kind of like a trackage rights train, but really isn't, is a run-through train. A run-through train, the trains are interchanged. A CSX train drives up to Memphis, the CSX crew gets off, a BNSF crew gets on, and the train is interchanged, and it continues on to the BNSF. The train the railroad that's operating the train provides the crews, and the cars and the engines in the train go into the operating railroad's account. So there's not really a host and a tenant. The railroad who owns the track, who's providing the crew over which the run-through train is operating, they actually participate in the revenue. So if you look at a waybill, the waybill would say CSX, Memphis, BNSF. And so the BNSF is part of gets part of the revenue for that move. So modeling, what can we do with modeling? One of the typical reasons that people put trackage rights onto a model railroad is to allow multiple railroads to switch a location. Unfortunately, that's not really all that common. If you think back to the Target Walmart analogy, why would I allow somebody else to take my business away from me? In the older trackage rights, local service wasn't that common. In the modern trackage rights, where you're doing it because of a merger, local service is much more common because the whole idea of granting the trackage rights is to allow competition, and in order to have competition, you have to allow the local service. One of the more common things is reciprocal switching. That's where the host railroad will switch the cars for the tenant railroad, act as a switching service for them, and the tenant railroad is billed on a per car basis. But as far as all the billing and all the other stuff, the host railroad is not even on the billing. It's entirely transparent. It looks like the tenant railroad did all the work, but actually the host railroad did it. Now, there's one other thing that is real common on modeling, is that you have some sort of a short line that's going to operate from a junction to a yard. That if it's a situation where the host railroad sold off a branch line to a short line and that became the short line, that might be fairly common. If it's where the short line was originally its own railroad, that's probably not as common. You got to remember that the trackage rights train operates using the host railroad's timetable and rules. So any crew operating on the main track on a trackage rights situation has to be qualified on the host railroad's crews. And the host railroad gets kind of nervous on especially little small railroads operating on their main track from a safety standpoint. One of the other things that gets kind of hairy with modeling is the backstory. A lot of people weave these very complicated backstories. I'll just say this, that just because a railroad has a major event like a tunnel collapse, a bridge fire, something landslide, another railroad is under absolutely no obligation whatsoever to grant the other railroad trackage rights. You know, oh well, you had your bridge burned down. That's sad. It sucks to be you, but you got to figure out how to fix it. So you know, there's a lot of once again, the Target Walmart analogy. What is the enticement? So you have to figure out, when you're figuring out your backstory, what's the carrot or what's the stick. And generally, the only people that really have a stick are the government. In most other cases, the only way that the railroad gets trackage rights is by a carrot, by swapping something, giving the two railroads swap something of value to them operationally in order to get the trackage rights. Now, of course, you're a modeler, you can say, it's my railroad, I granted him trackage rights, here we go. Or the slightly more creative one is, oh, this trackage rights was granted over 100 years ago. Nobody remembers why they did it. And there are trackage rights that go back over 100 years. Matter of fact, we'll talk about one that's almost 100 years old. The other thing that you can do is you can use the different items that are in the contract, the interline service agreement, to add some different challenges or play value. There's route limitations where a train can get on and off. You know, if this type of train has to exit here and this type of train has to exit there. There's work event limitations. Which industries can be switched. You may not have all the industries in a town, or something that are accessible to the trackage rights train. So that can give you some options to add some different stuff that you can work with. For example, here in the diagram on the left, the red railroad has gotten trackage rights over the blue railroad between the 2 points circled on that green route. Now, there is probably no way in the world that the red railroad is going to get any rights to switch any industries on that green route, because historically, prior to granting the trackage rights, they had no access to those industries. There was no service there. So they're not going to get any rights to switch any of those industries. However, on the diagram on the right, so there you've got the former red line weaves back and forth and crosses the blue line or the trackage rights route in 2 or 3 locations. So it is entirely feasible that you could say that at those locations where those trains historically crossed, that the red railroad might have access to switch some of the industries at those locations, because from a historical standpoint, before the trackage rights were granted, they had access to those industries because both railroads were in town. So after the trackage rights are granted, the red railroad might be able to to negotiate being able to still switch those industries at those junction locations. So that's an option. So let's talk about a few different trackage rights scenarios. This is one of my favorites. It's the train from hell. The Missouri Pacific between Fort Worth and Houston, Texas. It was two crew districts. It merged into one crew district, 250 miles long. So a train between Houston and Fort Worth on the Missouri Pacific was touched by 4 or 5 different railroads, depending on how you want to look at it, and by at least 6 and 7 if you include a tower operator, 7 dispatchers if you include the tower operator. But it was all the trackage rights was overhead. There was no local service done on any of the trackage rights. So we'll start out in beautiful downtown Houston, Texas, Settegast Yard. I used to work there at the dawn of time. Settegast Yard, that's an interesting, it was a joint facility. The HB&T is owned by the Missouri Pacific and the Santa Fe, 50-50. The Settegast Yard was owned by the Missouri Pacific. The track was owned and maintained by the Missouri Pacific. The car department and the local locomotive department was Missouri Pacific. All the engines, switch engines used were Missouri Pacific, but it was operated by the Houston Belt and Terminal. So all the switch crews, all of the yard masters, and all of the train masters in the yard were all HB&T employees. So you leave Settegast Yard, so that's an interesting option. Here, where is my, oh, there it is. Okay, so we leave Settegast Yard operating on the Houston Belt and Terminal. That's dispatched by the Rail Traffic Control, RTC. We get up here to Belt Junction, make a hard right turn and get on the Missouri Pacific Palestine sub, dispatched by the Palestine sub dispatcher. Drive up to Spring Junction, make a left-hand turn and get onto the Fort Worth sub, Missouri Pacific Fort Worth sub, dispatched by the Missouri Pacific Fort Worth sub dispatcher. So we're 30 miles out of town and we're already 3 dispatchers. Get up here to Bryan, and between Bryan and Navasota, it operates over the Southern Pacific, dispatched by the Southern Pacific dispatcher, gets back on the Missouri Pacific, operates to Valley Junction, Texas, crosses the Missouri Pacific, and goes up to Waco. At Scenic Waco, Texas, it gets on the Katy and is dispatched by the Katy dispatcher on trackage rights up to Tower 55. Tower 55, which by the way is the one place in Texas where every single railroad in the state of Texas crosses. At Tower 55, executes a hard left-hand turn and gets on the former Texas and Pacific, dispatched by the Baird sub-dispatcher. Now, if you want to count the 7th dispatcher, it's the tower operator at Tower 55 when that was a manned tower. But you had, in 250 miles, 4 different railroads, 6 dispatchers. I spent a lot of time talking to different dispatching offices about trains operating over on that line. But that gives you a whole lot of, a whole lot of different options as far as trains operating on different little bits and pieces of trackage rights. This is another one, Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the Cotton Belt and the Missouri Pacific. The Cotton Belt operated is the daylight orange and then the dashed tan color. And the Missouri Pacific is the Jenks blue line. The Cotton Belt operates, and the MOP operated through downtown Pine Bluff, 1 block apart had their main lines, and then at the west end, left end of Pine Bluff, the Cotton Belt crossed the Missouri Pacific on a diamond. The Cotton Belt also had a branch up towards Little Rock that broke off and paralleled roughly the Missouri Pacific up towards scenic Little Rock. The city of Pine Bluff decided that they just did not like having two main lines a block apart, so they negotiated a deal where they created a double track line on one of the right-of-ways. And the Missouri Pacific right-of-way was chosen because by doing that, the Cotton Belt could abandon part of their old line, with the remainder of their line to Little Rock. So the trade-off was by giving up dispatching and operating on the Missouri Pacific, the Cotton Belt got to abandon some of their trackage. So the Cotton Belt would come in over here on this side, would come through the connection, operate on the double track, and exit on the out the other side. If you look at a map of this, a larger map, it's actually the crossing point of an X. The Missouri Pacific is over west on the west side and operates from the northwest to the southeast, and the Cotton Belt operates from the northeast to the southwest, and they cross here at Pine Bluff. So this is the one spot on the two railroads where you could have two southbound trains have a head-on collision. There were also two other things that were involved in here. Is over here on the, hopefully you guys can see over on the side. Oh, there we go. Is right over here on the, is the Planters Cotton Oil mill. And they got cottonseed and made cottonseed meal, cottonseed oil, etc. But because of the way the connection was built here, it severed the access to that by the Cotton Belt. And so the Cotton Belt, the Missouri Pacific reciprocal switched for the Cotton Belt to that cottonseed mill. And so the Cotton Belt would interchange a cut of cars to the Missouri Pacific, and then as the cottonseed mill ordered in cars, the Missouri Pacific would spot them for the Cotton Belt, pull them, and then interchange them back. As far as the shipper knew, and as far as the waybill showed, the Missouri Pacific wasn't even involved in it. It was all Cotton Belt move because it was a reciprocal switch. Just as a note, the primary move that they made, remember those Golden West cars, the big blue cars with the red and yellow checkerboard herald? That's what they served that plant with. The SP had a special rate up to feed mills in Oregon from Pine Bluff, and they would load those with cottonseed meal for animal feed. On the other end of town, on the left end, a couple miles west of town, there was a branch, a little industrial lead, the Paperton lead, that had a paper mill and a couple bag plants. And over there, the reciprocal switch was that the Cotton Belt and the Missouri Pacific alternated with years switching it. So for 1 year, the Cotton Belt would effectively be the host, and it would switch all the industries and then deliver cars for the Missouri Pacific. And then on the next year, the Missouri Pacific would be the host and the Cotton Belt would be the tenant, and the Missouri Pacific would switch and spot cars for the Cotton Belt. So that's a way, if you want to have two different railroads switching your industries, you can have a thing where they swap off every 6 months or a year and switch the industries. By doing that, it did allow the Cotton Belt to abandon their line towards Little Rock. And finally is one called Joe Junction. And I like this one because if you modeled at half scale, you could do this in 15 feet. This is where the former Frisco, former BN4 and BNSF, crossed the and had trackage rights over the Katy, former Katy, former MOP, former UP, or now current UP, operating over the Red River just north of Denison, Texas. The Frisco came in from the northwest and exited to the southeast. The Katy came in from the northeast and exited to the southwest. So at some point in the dawn of time, there was a diamond there where the Frisco crossed the Katy. The trackage rights across the bridge were granted in 1926. So remember when I said, you know, you can always say, well, the trackage rights are 100 years old, and I don't quite remember. This is trackage rights that's over almost 100 years old, and that's just from the 20s. We also talked about how trackage rights are inherited through a bunch of different mergers in that. Well, there's at least 5 different railroads that have been involved in the trackage rights that's over this bridge. So the trackage rights were granted in 1949. A little bit south of this, didn't really affect this bridge particularly, but south of there, the line south of there, there was a line change due to a dam being put in the Red River and forming Lake Texoma. So that was a line change in 1949. And then in 1956, the Katy single tracked the bridge and got rid of a lot of their double tracks. So that, if you look very closely at the bridge abutments on there, you can see there's the top of the bridge abutments where there was the second track across those abutments, the second bridge. So the Katy, since it was operating on theirs, and here's the switch, so it's actually down here is the south switch, and up here is the north switch. So in this one little spot, you have trackage rights. You actually have 2 sets of trackage rights because the UP, the former Missouri Pacific, has trackage rights over the Katy on the Katy route. Then the Frisco has trackage rights from the north switch to the south switch. You had a bridge retirement. You had a single track where they went from double track down to single track, and you had a line change due to a lake being formed. So all of that is going on there. There's all sorts of different opportunities for somebody to model this right in that one little area. So hopefully I have not confused you too much. And if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them.
All right. I appreciate it, Dave. We've got a few questions. I think some of these have already been answered, but I'll ask them anyway.
Okay.
K. Travers asks, railroads rules were used. How was that determined? I think it's just part of the agreement, right?
Yes. Well, yes, it is the host railroad, their operating rules, and their timetable were the rules used to operate the trains over the trackage rights portion.
Okay.
And then any of the train placement stuff and other ancillary things that were in the special instructions, those would be on the tenant railroads.
Got it.
Rules.
All right. Chuck's asking, is there a specific name for the arrangement where the Western Pacific and the Southern Pacific each own parallel single track lines across Nevada, but operated them jointly as a double track main?
A lot of times they called that paired track, and
Okay.
that was actually fairly common. It is the Rock Island and the CB&Q had the same, or Fort Worth and Denver technically, Had that same thing going on between Denver and down into Texas, the SP, and that's where they operated as essentially as a joint facility.
Got it. Let's see. I think you answered this. Would a tenant ever have the right to switch industries on the host? I think that the answer was
Yes, they
yes.
would have.
Yep.
There are normally, if it's not related to a merger, normally the tenant railroad would have had to have rights to switch it before the trackage rights were granted.
Okay. When were they first used? Mid 1800s? I mean, does this go all
I'd
the
say
way back?
I'd say they went a long time back. I
Okay.
don't know. Yeah, but I know that there are ones that are pre-1900. So.
All right. Run-through trains. Crews are interchanged, but is equipment required to change? The group answer is no. Whole train runs through with power. Talking about how, you know, you can see pretty much any railroad's engines on any railroad these days, where the power just keeps right on going.
Yeah, that's now the run-through trains is a whole nother cool subject, and I also had to deal with that a lot. But a run-through train, the whole train is interchanged, and the locomotives and the cars moves from one railroad's account to the other railroad's account. So at the moment it's interchanged, the railroad that has received the train in interchange is now responsible for horsepower hours, or responsible for fuel consumption. They're paying per diem on the cars, they're paying mileage on the cars, and the other railroad that had the train, their responsibility stops. So that is a completely different thing than the trackage rights.
Got it. And including the crew too, right?
Well, the crews normally the crew changes.
Okay.
I say normally because the thing about railroads is there's an exception to every single rule, and you can find
more exceptions than there are rules. So
you can find one spot where they did.
Yep.
For example, the run-through trains between the Norfolk Southern and the UP through Salem, Illinois. The interchange point was actually back up at the switch, but the Norfolk Southern crew operated the train down to Salem, and that's actually where they got off.
So, I mean, it's all a matter of what they negotiated,
yes.
I think, in a lot of these cases. So,
yes.
All right, we got another question about, are transfers considered trackage rights, and do they have to be cleared by the host if they stay in yard limits on the host railroad, or just the yard master?
Normally, usually there is some sort of agreement. There's a separate agreement for interchange between the railroads, and that allows them to operate over the other railroad. It's kind of, you could call it trackage rights. It's maybe not.
It's kind of neutral territory between two railroads, that they both have access to this interchange track.
It's not neutral. One railroad owns the track, or one entity owns the track, and the other railroad has a right to operate over it.
Okay.
And there's usually, and the interchange, if you look at interchange agreements, there is typically, it will specify which track or tracks interchange is affected on.
Got it.
And so those are the tracks that the train can operate on. So if I'm a UP train delivering to the SP, I can't just run willy-nilly over the SP.
Right. You have a specific place that you're allowed to go, and that's where you're supposed to leave your cars or pick up cars. So, all right, let's say, keep going here. From Burr, would a reciprocal switch agreement be a condition of entering into a trackage rights contract, or were they negotiated separately by different people?
They could be separate. They could be done at the same time.
Okay, so maybe.
Maybe, yeah. It depends on it depends on the order. So in other words, if I'm going to establish trackage rights, and I'm going to where I would want to have switching at the time I established the trackage rights, yeah, they would establish the switching arrangements as part of the trackage rights agreement. If for some reason I wanted to have, I had trackage rights already, or I had a reciprocal switching agreement already, and then I wanted to do trackage rights or add reciprocal switching, they would be maybe two different, or an amendment to it.
Okay. Are the agreements typically for a very long / indefinite period of time, say 99 years, or are there situations where they need to be renewed periodically, maybe every 10 or unless some ground rule changed?
Normally, they are in perpetuity.
Okay.
And do not expire. There are, I think I have seen a couple where they did have an expiration date, but those are usually pretty rare.
Okay.
For example, the 1926 agreement that we talked about is still used today, 100 years later.
Got it. All right. The only other request was that the handout you sent me, if you can regenerate that with page numbers, that was the only request. If you can do that, I'll put it up on the OPSEG website as part of the past meetups. And one of the last question here that we'll take, are trackage rights granted when there is a temporary diversion such as a flood? I think that was sort of a special situation, right?
That's the detour. That's the detour agreement.
Got it.
And that's where the railroads, Railroad A has some sort of a disaster. And so Railroad A starts looking for where can they detour, what are all the different connections that it has. And they generally know all of them because they've used them before a gazillion times. And so then Railroad A would call the different railroads and say, I had a disaster, I want to detour 3 trains westbound and 2 trains eastbound between A and B. Can you do that? And then that railroad would have a huddle and figure out what they can handle based on the capacity of the line, what their crew situation is to provide pilots, what their maintenance agreements, what all kind of maintenance are going on. They figure that out. They call the other railroad back and say, okay, we can do this, this, and this. The train can only be 7,200 feet long and has to have at least 1.5 horsepower per trailing ton, and can't have any wide loads. And so they say, okay, that sounds great. They write up a letter that says that, and they send it between the two. They sign it, and then it's done. And then it sort of works like trackage rights. They alert each other and they tell each other where the trains are, and the host railroad calls the pilots to meet the train based on the ETAs, and it all works.
Yep. Remember when I lived in St. Paul back in 1990, I lived right near the, I think what they called the High Line running through the middle of St. Paul. And that summer, for some reason, there was an issue with, I think it was the Mohawk Indians up in Canada. They were blocking this key bridge, so everything was diverting all the way through Minnesota. I mean, it was just train after train after train because of, again, essentially an unplanned diversion there. So
the two biggest ones I know about were back in the 1990s, they had those huge Midwestern floods that completely changed the entire map of the Midwest. And the other one was when Hurricane Katrina wiped out the Norfolk Southern and the CSX east of New Orleans. We diverted trains from New Orleans to Memphis, trains from Memphis to St. Louis, trains from St. Louis up to Chicago. And we actually had a conference call once a day with all the railroads in the Midwest, and actually went through train by train what everybody had crews to take and what gateways, and allocated the spaces for the trains over the entire Midwestern gateway. And we did that for months.
I mean, it basically becomes, I would, obviously there's some money changing hands, but this becomes like a mutual aid type thing, just like in the fire and EMS where, hey,
money
we've got
to change hands, but it does. Yeah. It is a mutual aid. The railroads are,
they have to get along, basically.
They're fierce competitors, but they will cooperate. For example, the Union Pacific, in anticipation of the hurricane, had reserved contractors for mobile housing, for food service, for front-end loaders. They had ballast trains pre-positioned. They had electrical generators pre-positioned. After the hurricane hit east of the city of New Orleans, the Union Pacific had minimal damage. So we called the CSX and the Norfolk Southern and said, hey, do you need any of these? Right. And we released all of our contractors to them so that they would be able to start work on their stuff.
Just like how the power companies have their mutual aid agreements with all of their the big trucks and linemen and so on. So, all right. Well, that seems to be the last question. So, Dave, thanks so much for presenting.
Thanks for allowing me.
And I appreciate everybody's questions. I'll go ahead and open up the security if people have questions. And this is basically ending the formal program. The next session will be in 2 weeks, and watch your email for the invitation.